Good afternoon. I'm Emily Lawler with MLive, and I'm here with Dave Dulio from Oakland University and John Sellek from Harbor Strategic. The election is coming right up. I can tell you that all of MLive's political reporters are working hard, excited to get to actual election day on November 3rd, Tuesday, obviously. And excited to preview it here today with all of you. So I've got some good questions lined up for Dave and John, but I'm sure you all have good questions as well. So you can drop those in the comments. I'll see them there, and I will make sure that our panelists see them and hear them too. So Dave, John, I wanted to start us off like right at the top of the ticket with the presidential race. Obviously, the biggest thing that I think is on a lot of people's minds right now. And the first thing I'm wondering is, will this be as close as it was in 2016 when only 10,700 votes separated the Democrat and Republican candidates?
I think it's pretty hard to match that. It's incredibly close. Michigan's had a lot of close elections. Gary Peters has lost a close election to Mike Cox in the past. John Engler won an incredibly close election against Jim Blanchard. He's featured in a big story today in the news. Those don't happen often, but that doesn't mean it won't be a close race. It just may not be down to that kind of 10,000 vote level. But what we are seeing when you look at the national polling is that the excitement level measured by each party is essentially equally as high. We don't normally see that. Usually it's one party or the other that's higher than the other. In fact, sometimes when they ask, who are you more excited to go out and vote for if you're a Trump or a Biden, Trump is usually a couple of clicks ahead. So excitement is a huge measure. And then clearly just how many Republicans are there to turn out in Michigan will be a bigger deal as well.
Dave, what do you think?
I think John's right. I think it's tough to get it to that tight of a finish as we had 4 years ago. I think it's going to be close. I think, and history in Michigan tells us that the Democrats had this string of top of the ticket victories between 92 and 12. But if we dig down a little deeper into each of those, maybe except for the Obama landslide in 08, they were all within 10 points and the other ones were within 5. So I think Michigan's a competitive state, and sometimes we see things that mask that competitiveness. I would expect it to be close. And I think, frankly, that you're seeing both campaigns come here in the last 4 or 5 days before the election. That tells me they think it's going to be close too.
And I should say, actually, I'm filling in for my colleague Malachi Barrett, who was slated to moderate this and ended up covering a presidential campaign stop. So he's covering, I believe, Mike Pence tonight. But yeah, what does it say that the candidates are putting such a focus on Michigan so close to the end? We've got a visit from Donald Trump himself. There's one on Tuesday. There's one coming up on Friday. Members of the Trump family are here virtually all the time between those two dates, and I think some on the weekend as well. We've got Biden pulling out the big guns. He's bringing Obama on Saturday. What do you make of that?
Well, first and foremost, go ahead. The most important thing that usually we hear about in elections on TV in the news is how much money people raised. But the thing that goes kind of unspoken is their schedule and their time. Time is absolutely the most valuable thing in a candidate's schedule. And right now, pretty much any day of the week, there's either a Biden or a Trump somewhere here. Like, I'm pretty sure if you asked a Biden or a Trump to come over for coffee, you probably will get one at your house. We're like Iowa right now in the caucus and primary days. So back during the summer, I felt like the question I got the most as the Republican side always getting questioned on these things was, how come Michigan's not a battleground state? How come no one's here? How come there's not as many ads on the air as there are in other places? We wanted to trip over ourselves to be the first to say we're not a battleground state, but clearly Michigan is. And there's a lot of factors for that. One is that the president's map nationally doesn't go a lot of other directions. At this point, it looks like it goes through the Midwest if he's got a chance to win. Like Dave said, I think what's really important to read into it is if Biden thought that Michigan was wrapped up and taken care of, there's no way he would be here. Maybe his wife would be here, maybe, and he certainly wouldn't be sending Barack Obama here. So they're seeing something in the numbers that tells them they also need to buttress what they have here.
Yeah, I would just add to that maybe they don't believe the public polls that are getting so much attention these days across Michigan, right? And I, John's exactly right that the most valuable thing that a candidate has right now is time. It's not money, it's time. It's because there's always a shrinking amount of it as you approach election day. And Joe Biden wouldn't be coming here. He wouldn't be bringing out the big guns, as you say, in Barack Obama if he didn't think that there was reason to be on the ground in Michigan. And I have to think, too, that maybe they're concerned about African-American turnout, maybe not being up to the levels that they need it or want it. And that's why they're bringing Obama here.
So I think both of you have mentioned in passing polling at this point. Two questions. What is it saying right now, and can we trust it? John, I'll go to you first.
Boy, I think it's one of the biggest questions of the race. It's really one of the biggest questions of politics in general. And it's not that pollsters are bad guys or bad girls. They're trying to figure it out. Technology, people's willingness to answer the phone, let alone their door, all that stuff is becoming more and more complicated. We've actually seen the pollsters at the New York Times and other places on Twitter complain that when they call into Michigan, they're having to call for far more days to try to get the minimum number of people to answer the phone that they need. And then on top of it, you have to start worrying about which demographics are answering the phone and are they giving you a skewed view. I think pollsters are literally working around the clock and they're having to experiment on the go. Dave might be able to talk to that more than I, but they're trying to figure out how to use texting to try to get your attention. They're trying to figure out how to somehow fold in online questioning. There's a lot more ability for people to track what you're doing on the computer all day. So be aware that's happening more and more. They're trying to make it work, but it's probably what I call the ghost of 2016. It's the number one reason why Democrats won't call Michigan for anybody yet, because they just know what happened last time.
Yeah, I think pollsters have a really hard job all the time trying to figure out how to measure public opinion, right? It's not an easy thing to do. There's a science to it, but there's also an art to it. I think in terms of the pre-election polls, we'll know after we get results whether or not the pollsters have been able to sort of crack the code in terms of sampling and weighting in places like Michigan, where, and let's be fair, right? In 2016, the national polls were right. They said Hillary Clinton would win by 2 or 3 points, and she won nationally by 2 or 3 points. But they were off significantly in important places like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida, Wisconsin. And anybody that's watching this knows that those were the states then, and they're the states now that are going to decide this thing. So the question is, have pollsters in Michigan and those other states figured out how to sample? And I think it's really interesting to see the different polls that come out individually and how different their results are. And I think, I don't know, I don't have any inside info, that they're making different assumptions about election day turnout, absentee turnout. They're making different guesses as to what voter turnout's going to look like, and that leads to those varying results.
And I think we see a little bit of an echo, not to interrupt, sorry. We see an echo of that in what's happening, and you might come up to this later, with absentee voting, because we're seeing all these numbers come out saying, hey, this percentage of the people who filed their ballots or cast their ballots are, quote, Democrats, or this percentage are, quote, Republicans. That data is also in the mix as well. All the data they compile about individual voters, and then they attempt to attach a score to you to predict how you've been. I think that worked a lot better prior to 2016 and especially prior to 2020, but you hear that echo and that data as well. And it was one of the things I was concerned about, frankly, with early voting. There are all these pluses and minuses, and we don't technically have early voting because I don't want someone to come at me saying that I said that, but you can vote in person absentee. Yes, thank you, Emily. But the point I was trying to make is that everybody is racing to leak their data out to sort of impact how people feel about how the election's going. I was always concerned that information, in the back room that's being counted before election day could be leaked out. But that's essentially the same thing's happening by the way that the partisans on both sides are scoring who returned their ballot. And that's all tied to the polling and trying to guess as to what this turnout looks like.
Well, I heard the word result, which is something I want to ask you about because we're hearing, of course, that results could not be election day, but maybe we'll experience somewhat of an election week by the time we know the final answer in every race. How does that impact how you're looking at this race? And also, is exit polling going to be anything we can even come close to relying on this cycle?
I'm glad you brought that up because that struck me recently that exit polling might just be a disaster this year, right? Because from all accounts, and John knows more about this than I do, right? But by all accounts, more Democrats are voting absentee than Republicans, and more Republicans look like they're going to vote election day than Democrats, right? So if that's the case, how do those exit pollsters, again, sample correctly to get a not a picture of election day, but a picture of the electorate, which is, I think, going to be exceedingly hard this time around, which just gets into sort of the information that's going to come out, as John was talking about with the sort of data that's getting injected, right? Election night, we're going to get data injected into the discussion from exit polls, and it might be worthless. It might just be completely bogus.
Right. And clearly, the legislature, they worked with the governor. They passed a law that allowed absentee ballots to start to at least be processed, not counted, the day before, which I think will help.
Pre-processed, I should say. They're very technical about that.
Yes, pre-processed. So that's going to help. But I think we should be pretty comfortable thinking that the final results may not be known for several days. But, that's why Facebook even has now extended their ban on new advertising past election day. At first, it was just going to be this last week that all of our clients had to have all their ads uploaded ahead of time so that no new last-minute misinformation type things could be there. And then they said, oops, we're going to go even further than that so people aren't using our platform to claim victory. And what I hate to admit my age or anything, but what I have been thinking about lately is 2000. And I was working on the George W. Bush campaign. And to imagine if right now we had to go through an extended unknown period where a whole state like Florida had to be recounted. We were all annoyed about it back then, but America made it through it. Al Gore graciously said, okay, I'm stepping aside. It ended. I don't feel like America would be as calm and comfortable with it this time around. So let's cross our fingers they get it done right and get it done accurately.
Yeah, I think that's on the money. I think the chances are that here in Michigan, just going by what the Secretary of State has said, that we're not going to have everything counted by dawn the day, November 4th, and I think that's going to be the case in some other states too, for reasons that are similar to what's happening here in Michigan in terms of counting absentees, but. There's battles over when ballots can arrive. Sometimes some states are making the case that they should be able to arrive past election day, right? Well, if you throw that in the mix, well, that's just another layer of uncertainty and another layer of counting that has to take place. I think, John mentioned before Trump's path to the presidency. Coming through the Midwest, I think there's another place that's important, and that's Florida. And as far as I know, Florida can count absentees early. So if they start to get some results, I think that might really tell us an important piece of information. If Florida can finish its counting election day, that gives us an important data point for that presidency race.
I think that, I make my joke about 2000 and waiting for Florida, but I think that the far left and the far right extreme are going to make a whole lot of noise. And they're going to be talking mostly to each other. It's kind of sad in my estimation, but I think the general public that's sort of in the middle is already exhausted from all of this. And they're going to kind of be, just wake me up when it's over. The election's already been going on seemingly for 100 years. And if it continues on a little bit further, it's my hope the way we'll get through it, unfortunately, is a lot of people are just like, just tell me later, and I'm gonna, go watch Netflix now.
Yeah, I think that you're right. The extremes on both sides are gonna make a bunch of noise, and I also think that the attorneys on both sides are going to file a bunch of lawsuits and in a bunch of different states. I think that that's pretty much a certainty.
I want to move down the ticket a little bit, because one question that people have been posing to me and that I certainly don't know the answer to, and maybe one of you does, is whether John James is inextricably tied to Donald Trump. In other words, is there a scenario, and Dave, we'll start with you, where Donald Trump could lose in Michigan, but John James could win over Gary Peters in that critical U.S. Senate?
I think that's absolutely a possibility. John James ran ahead of Bill Clinton last time around, and I think that there's no question that he could overperform the top of the ticket. Yeah, no doubt.
John, what's your read on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think that they haven't seen a Republican statewide candidate outperform a presidential nominee at that level. But, it just happened in 2016 in fellow sort of Midwestern states. People are complaining Pennsylvania is not Midwestern now. I guess I just caught myself up in that debate. In Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson and Pat Toomey, the senators there, each ran ahead of Donald Trump in those states, definitely by a small margin, don't get me wrong, but they were able to do it. And I think one strength of the James campaign and his messaging has been to create his own space. I think that's how he's been as successful as he's been so far.
Yeah, I still think he's tainted a bit by some previous statements, and the Gary Peters campaign or allies of his campaign, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, the super PACs that are playing out in that race are, to their credit, using those statements that John James has made previously about the president against him, right? And that's it's tough for John James probably to see those things from a couple of years ago brought back up, but they're out there, and they're going to do it, right? I mean, Republicans would do the same thing if the shoe was on the other foot.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and maybe what has backfired a little bit, inside the Dem circle, they talk about the 2,000% all the time. But in the advertising campaigns, Peters himself has not sought to make himself partisan. He's sought to make himself, essentially, he says bipartisan, but it's really nonpartisan, to the extent that his own supporters who are getting a little bit nervous about these polls are like, Gary, why is this guy calling himself a Democrat? The wind is behind Democrats more naturally right now. And he doesn't do that. He's actually probably the only Democrat Senate candidate in the country who ran an ad with Donald Trump in it, in a positive light, that he had sat down at the table and was able to get things done with Donald Trump. And, that may be in part simply because Peters is obviously a smart guy. He's been through politics for a very long time. He's won, he's lost. So he's got the experience to know what he's doing. But his campaign has been more about explaining that he's like the best constituent service guy that ever existed, in a way that's not capturing the attention of people. He, in his personality, is just not there to like capture the attention and love of people in the way that James has more of an electric personality. And I don't think they counted on that. So going back to your original question, they thought they could push this 2,000% Trump thing and it would automatically work. Well, first, Peters never really took the Democrat side, and that's in part why we saw so many undecided voters, especially among African Americans. And then secondly, they didn't count on the fact that John James can go on TV and do these ads where he's talking to camera and he's likable, and likable still actually counts in politics, as ugly as it's been lately.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and John again knows more about this than I do. But I wonder if part of the Peters strategy on not using the James statement about 2,000% support of Trump is maybe trying to leave that up to the other groups that are playing, so that Gary Peters doesn't look like the guy that's making those attacks, right? We often see that as a strategy by candidates to let the quote unquote negative stuff be from the party or the super PACs, right? And I think too that I think that's an interesting point about John James and his personality and his image, right? I mean, he's and I've said this to others before. He's straight out of Central Casting, right? I mean, he's charismatic, he's young, he's vibrant, he's got business experience. He's a vet. He's got all these things he can draw, and he does in his commercials and in his appearances. And I think that that's really an effective thing for voters to be drawn to.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the New York Times did a story just in the last week about the U.S. Senate race, and they were quoting Democrats saying, for God's sake, nobody knows who the Democrat and the Republican are in this race. And how did Peters let that slip away and get out of his hands? But that's what he did. And so they're trying to fix it. And now you're seeing, like Dave said, the third parties are coming in. And Peters himself, his rhetoric has gotten a lot more aggressive, directly going after John James and trying to say that he's tied to Trump. But, then, like I said earlier, they didn't count on the political talent that he has. He's able to go on the air in his most recent ad and say, can you believe this? I'm a 39-year-old black guy from Detroit, and Gary Peters is trying to say I am Donald Trump. That's ridiculous. And then he's able to flip it and stay really positive and keep on going. So James has a lot going for him. Gary Peters has the power of incumbency and his experience in office. He does have this laundry list of issues he's been pitching. But, some of the folks at the Lansing newsletter Gongwer said that the ads were well done, but that they left no footprint. They left no impression. And that's, again, part of the reason why we're seeing Barack Obama come in. I think we saw Reverend Al Sharpton was in Detroit with Gary Peters today. He's trying to shore up his base only a few days from Election Day.
Well, inching down the ticket a little bit here, what congressional races do you guys find the most interesting right now? Dave, we'll start with you.
Probably the third, the Amash seat that seems to be pretty competitive. But I think that's the most intriguing one at the moment.
What about you, John?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'm not sure everybody had that at the top of their list. The first and foremost races that people had been watching for almost 2 years was what was happening in the 8th district, where I live, with Alyssa Slotkin, and then right next door in the 11th with Haley Stevens. They took 2 Republican seats, and they were part of the wave of Democrat women who took office. They were definitely not part of the more progressive wing of the new elected officials. They've been very conservative in their talk and their outlook for the most part. Alyssa Slotkin goes on Fox News and talks about national security. For God's sake, that's like catnip for Republicans in that district. It's what the Mike Rogers and before her had done. So everybody was watching those seats to see what would happen. I think for a number of reasons, the fact that redistricting is coming, the fact that those 2 incumbents were plugged into the National Democratic funding raising machine. Alyssa Slotkin's raised $8 million. It's almost incomprehensible for a little 8th congressional seat. So she's done very well on that. And it made it really hard to recruit candidates who were going to go up against a lot of money in a seat that might not exist, because we all assume Michigan will lose a seat. There's going to be a lot of shifting around going there on that front. So we also watched the 10th congressional district because Paul Mitchell unexpectedly decided to retire and not run for re-election. That primary is passed, and we're talking about that seat less because it's more than likely going to stay Republican. So it turns your eyes to both the 3rd congressional in Kent County and then the 6th congressional in Southwest Michigan.
So
yeah, I would just echo what John said about the 8th and the 11th. I think the fundraising success that both Alyssa Slotkin and Haley Stevens had right from the get-go, they really didn't even slow down their fundraising efforts after 2018. They really hit the ground running and were raising money hand over fist in the first part of 2019. And that served them well now, right? Because it's really hard, I think, for a congressional candidate to compete in the era of coronavirus, in a presidential year when you've got a competitive presidential race, competitive Senate race, and all of the air is kind of sucked out or taken up by that. And when you've got this huge funding disadvantage, what do you do with that? I think it's really hard for challengers in those races. Those 2 districts, interestingly enough, are both of them include Oakland University. The campus is split right down the middle between the 8th and the 11th. So you can go from one part of campus to another and be in 2 different congressional districts.
I did not even know that. That's awesome.
Which part is your office in?
The 11th.
Okay, good to know.
I had to think about that for a minute.
That's weird. The 3rd congressional is unexpected in part because this whole series of events took place where Justin Amash went down this path of kind of self-destruction, to be polite, or principled, not running for re-election and retiring. From the other hand, regardless, he's gone. And he would have won the seat, no problem, had he stayed in it. So, I mean, the base of the seat is very Republican, particularly outside of Kent County. What is happening is there isn't an adjustment there. We've all spent a ton of time hearing about Oakland County and its change over time from Republican to Democrat, that the Democrats are taking on more of the suburban, higher education, higher income level voters. We saw that through Oakland County and Western Wayne in 2018, where the Republicans lost a lot of state legislative seats there. Kent County didn't used to get talked about very much. We never talked about the component parts of Kent County because we did not have to. It was the city of Grand Rapids was Democrat and the rest was all Republican. But now we're starting to look more closely in the news. The experts have always been looking at what's happening. And I, not jokingly, really say that Kent County is kind of like Oakland County West. It's got a lot of similar statistics. It's, you know, it's more white actually than Oakland, but it's got the same above average income, above average education attainment level. It's the only part of the state that is growing. It's growing the fastest anyway, which means as every city in Michigan from Traverse City on down is getting bluer, surrounded by red, Grand Rapids got super blue just from that. But then it added a lot of people who are moving in who are blue. Then the inner ring suburbs to the south, like Kentwood and Wyoming, they've become more blue. So the Republicans that are being squeezed from that lower socioeconomic level, working class there. But then East Grand Rapids, which is kind of the equivalent of Birmingham in Oakland County, if you've been there, also went super far to the left. I think that their mayor that just got elected is a supporter of Bernie Sanders. That's a big switch from what used to happen in East Grand Rapids. So the Republicans are getting kind of sandwiched there from both sides in a way that's very similar to what already happened in Oakland County. And that then means that Peter Meyer didn't do anything wrong in his campaign. He's actually done it very well, and he still has a very good shot of winning. But he's facing all that's going on in the atmosphere above his campaign.
I think that's a really interesting way to think about Kent County as kind of what Oakland County, they're going through now, what Oakland County went through maybe 10 years ago, or that process is I think going to mirror each other. And it'll be interesting to see how Republican strategists deal with that in an area of the state that has been reliably Republican and conservative for decades and decades, right? Although I do think that there's a different brand of Republicanism in, say, West Michigan as compared to Southeast, as compared to up north, right? I think there's some real interesting differences that you can tease out.
Right.
So it sounds like if the story from the 2018 midterms was sort of the purpling of those two counties, that the story after 2020 might be sort of the bluing of those two counties more than we expected, huh? Or I guess exactly as much as you guys expect.
Well, I think so, but it's also interesting, right? That President Trump is coming to Oakland County later this week, Friday, right? And now maybe that's just because Oakland County's got a really good airport that he can land at and do his event, right? That's got to be part of it. But nonetheless, he's coming to Oakland County, and I think that is maybe an attempt. Whether it's a good idea or not is another question, but it might be an attempt to try to get some of those suburban voters back.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to talk about. And that we talked earlier about time being the most important thing on a candidate's schedule, where President Trump has been in Michigan over the last year and a half have all been mostly blue collar areas. He did a rally around in that Saginaw Midland Bay area, which is moving into the Republican side, and he's trying to juice that vote up and get more people to register to vote there. He went to Muskegon just I don't know, every week now seems like 100 years. So recently he went to Muskegon, which is kind of like the blue collar county in that zone. He went to Calhoun County and had his rally last year in Ballot Creek, which he won, which is part of the 3rd Congressional District. So they're pushing those areas really hard, and I think it is somewhat of a surprise now, which is really weird to say that a Republican presidential candidate is coming to Oakland County. We're like, wait, what? But I think the other part that is occurring to me today is, while they may be making a play to staunch the bleeding among those suburban voters, even though we spent all summer with everybody asking, what's the Trump campaign going to do to get those folks back? They also had work to do with seniors. And there's a whole lot of seniors in Southeast Michigan. And so it'll be interesting to see what his messaging is. But his television advertising campaign, at least down here in Southeast Michigan, now features the senior citizen talking about Medicaid Advantage and Medicare Advantage and all these other things related to seniors. Be interesting to see if that's where he's going with that visit too.
And flip that around, right, to say that it's interesting to note where he's not going. And I think that because it's next door, and maybe it's because there's not as good of an airport over there, but he's not going to Macomb, right? Which is an interesting strategic point, I think, to think about. And maybe it's because they feel like they've got that vote wrapped up and they've really maxed out what they can get out of Macomb County. Or maybe they're counting on the folks from Macomb driving across M59 and going to the Oakland County International Airport. It could be a whole combination of reasons, right? But I think that it's interesting, and who knows? Maybe he's back in Macomb on Sunday or Monday, right?
How do all these political trends we're talking about trickle down to the state house? Is there a chance that could be a Democratic body next cycle? Or I'm sorry, session.
I think first and foremost, in the past, if a Republican nominee had kind of like turned the lights off on Michigan, they just ghosted. And everybody underneath that person was left to fend for themselves. And that usually results in disaster. And even though the president is not spending as much on television here, he's getting outspent. The last time I looked, 3-1 in Southeast Michigan. And I don't think that's a choice. I think that is reflective of their financial position from what I've read. But nonetheless, they're committing a whole lot of time here. Like talked about, there's a Biden or Trump here every 5 seconds. That's going to work wonders for helping down ticket Republicans from John James on down. We talked about the polling had shown that Trump voters were as excited or more excited than Biden voters to show up. When you're trying to win these House races, you are really at the whim of what's happening up in the atmosphere above your head, no matter how hard you work. And we've seen ungodly amounts of money are pouring into these races on both sides. In those fights in the state house races. So the fact that the president and Biden are still fighting it out over Michigan means that most of the air war and the energy behind Republicans is still there to try to defend it. Next, I would say, if the rhetoric of the folks that passed the redistricting constitutional amendment last year is true, that the map that was drawn by Republicans is so Republican it's unfair, then it's probably a pretty good map. We're 10 years into it, so it's aged. But that's providing Republicans also with some kind of defense mechanism in winning these seats. But I think more than likely what we're going to see is we are seeing an acceleration of the realignment that took place at the presidential last time, of the blue collar union places going into the Republican hands, the suburbs moving out. That's why we're seeing so much attention focused on Oakland County and those House seats that are there.
Yeah, and one other thing on the trickle down, I've read quite a bit about how the Trump campaign is very bullish on their ground game, and I think if that's the case, that could also pay big dividends down ticket, where you're getting that more personal one-to-one messaging about, hey, vote Republican, right? And I think that can carry over into some of those state house races that we're talking about. Possible, yeah. And I think John's comment about the map is a good one. And I think we saw some of that in 2018, right? Because Democrats won a bunch of seats in 2018 that were supposedly so Republican that they were unfair. Well, they won them anyway. So, interesting to see if that continues.
Right. So Democrats need 4 seats to take away 4 seats from the Republicans to get the majority. They have enough targets to pull that off. The Republicans, though, have also started moving their funding and their guns and aimed them at seats that Trump won last time, primarily being the Bay City 96 House seat right now that they're going after. They started advertising and spending money in Downriver, which is another area that President Trump won in the House District 23. And they're spending money in places like Livonia that had been a Republican bastion for a long time. And the person that won is hardworking, good communicator as far as the Democrats go. She's very progressive. Might not quite fit how Livonia is yet. I've got a lot of family in Livonia, and it is a great place, great suburban place, but it's not fancy like Birmingham. It's not fancy like right next door Northville. It's a little more blue collar, and with only a 0.5% win in 2018 by the Democrat last time, and then the Republicans having the candidate that they really needed this time, Martha Tashnick, they've got to play there too. So it is really up in the air. I think that where we could end up is we could end up in a tie. and that sounds like the worst result ever. Just one more 2020 punch in the gut. The House has been tied before, once a little before my time in the early 90s under Engler. They actually worked it out then, and they shared power. Well, it doesn't seem like we can share this year, so we'll see how that goes.
Well, we're hitting up against our time here, but before I let you go, I want to ask what your election day is going to look like for you in this once-in-a-lifetime, hopefully, pandemic election, where, of course, it's nothing like we've observed, participated in, or covered before. So my personal routine is going to the pool and then going to the polls. I like to swim. I like to vote. All of that's out the window. I'll be voting absentee and I guess ordering my own pizza to not share with my newsroom. But Dave, what are you going to be doing?
I'll be in class. I've got class from 3 to 5 on election day. I'll be taking students' predictions on the Electoral College vote and the U.S. Senate outcomes. We'll have a contest in our class and see who wins the big prize. And then, like you, right, just sort of settling in, watching the whatever returns we get come in, and probably doing a lot more of these Zoom calls.
Is it a good prize?
Yeah.
Are you going to tell us what it is?
No, I'm not telling what it is. And then no.
I hope it's extra credit.
We're building suspense. It's not extra credit.
John, how are you spending it?
I've had bosses on campaigns before who went to the movie theater and just were inside the movie theater all day long.
They're open again.
Yeah, they are. I'm not going in, but my wife really wants to. It's one of our biggest fights right now. Thanks for bringing that up.
Sorry.
It's just going to be being a news junkie, and the problem is that Twitter provides more than enough access for being a junkie on news all day, every day. But it will especially that day, and then just getting ready to essentially follow what those turnouts look like in the suburbs in Oakland and Kent, and then what the turnouts look like in the those union blue collar areas like Monroe and Bay and Muskegon.
Well, we're happy to feed that news junkie habit for you, John, you, Dave, and of course everyone tuning in. We'll have live results posts rolling on MLive, of course, and also coverage from around the state in our 8 newspapers. So thank you so much for joining us for this preview. Of course, this is one of those things where we get to look back at how wrong we were, maybe a week or a whole cycle from now. But I really appreciate you joining me and sharing your expertise with our viewers. So thank you.
Sure, I'm sure that someone's tweeting right now that we're wrong, so we wouldn't have to wait.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, bye-bye.